a big day for South Africa's Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, bringing into Parliament a budget that most of us, I think, are trying to swallow, understand, question, and get to the bottom of it. I mean, for example, when was the last time that you had Standard Bank up 7.7% or ABSA up 7.4%, ShopRite 9.4%? What brings all those companies together? They are consumer facing. And what has the minister done? I am telling you, what you're looking at are gains that are stemming from that budget that was presented by the minister. In the meantime, the rand reversing losses are on the day of more than 1%. We're sitting at a gain, as you can see very clearly, of 0.4%. 15-cent move in a few hours. Tito Mboweni, you're a lion. But we know that the biggest thorn in South Africa's side are its state-owned enterprises, and two in particular, Eskom and South African Airways. This is what he had to say when he presented on both in Parliament.
Government will, in quotes, do whatever it takes, unquote, to ensure a stable electricity supply. As I said, it is our number one task. We have allocated 230 billion rand over the next 10 years to achieve the restructuring of the electricity sector. The current electricity shortfall will ease as Eskom completes critical maintenance work that they're doing. Bid window 4 of the renewable energy program is being accelerated. The rapid decline in renewable energy prices will give a new impetus momentum to bid window 5. Determinations to implement the integrated resource plan of 2019 are finished and await the concurrence of the National Energy Regulator. It will shortly be possible for municipalities in financially good standing positions to purchase electricity from independent power producers. Mr. President, the South African Airways sword of Damocles has fallen on us. SAA has been placed under business rescue, which will lead to a radically restructured airline. Over the medium term, government has allocated 16.4 billion rand to settle guaranteed debt and interest. The associated restructuring costs will be reprioritized within the budget. It is the very sincere hope of many that this intervention will lead to a sustainable airline that is not a burden to the fiscals.
The lion, that's Tito Mboweni. And I was going to do a little drum roll and say, and the winner is South African Airways. Are we throwing more scarce resources down the drain? Well, in the studio with me, I've got people who have got those answers. Makgopa Tshehla is Professor for Financial Management at Unisa Graduate School of Business Leadership. We also have Maarten Ackerman, Chief Economist at Citadel and Abdullah Verachia from Gibs and CEO of the Strategists. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I think all of us, when we were sitting, listening to the minister, giving his thoughts, telling us how he is going to be doing this over the next 3 years or so, would have been left, I think, with surprised looking faces and wondering where the minister is getting the courage to do what he did. Okay, so I want opening thoughts, first of all, on the parastatals before we widen the discussion to what the minister proposed in the budget. Can I begin with the academic?
Okay. I think it is interesting when he mentioned the 230 billion for restructuring the electricity over the last 10 years. However, there are no measures in place in terms of controlling those cost expenditure. And then further, if you look at the SAA, where he said there's a 16.4 billion to settle the debt, the guarantee over a short period of time. But it is not certain in terms of how he came up to those numbers, whether those numbers are sustainable or not.
Okay. Can I come to you, Abdullah?
So you call him a lion. I think it's a lion that eats some pilchard fish, which is always interesting out in Limpopo. He referenced the aloe tree today, which is also interesting. But I think the reality is that we've got to step back and really look at some of the sentiment that played out, that in a dwindling cake that we have and how you divide and slice up that cake, there's very little allocation in terms of what it could do. And so when you look at the state-owned resources or the state-owned companies and the allocation towards them, and as Prof has said, the almost 16 billion that was allocated towards South African Airways is particularly interesting given the short-term bailout that was advanced by the DBSA, or the loan provided by the DBSA, and the fact that Minister Pravin Gordhan spoke about the fact that by March that money will run out. It does mean that there has to be a more longer-term plan in terms of South African Airways.
Which is going to cost more resources?
Well, I think there are two parts, right? I think I work in the strategy space, and one of the things that we see is, yes, we've got to feed some of the short-term liquidity, but the reality is we have to have a more sustainable plan in terms of how South African Airways competes in a globally competitive airline industry. And it's particularly tough. It's tough because in the last 6 to 8 weeks, South African Airways has turned down and has changed a number of routes that they've had. They've cancelled significant routes. And that does mean that consumers who have choice will make different choices in terms of whether they fly South African Airways. So yes, we can take some of the short-term liquidity pain, but there has to be a specific plan in terms of what's the longer-term outlook for South African Airways.
If I am to shorten what you have said, you suggest to me that this is not the end of this story. Hold on with the thought. Martin?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the saving that he spoke about today through cutting expenditure, 60 billion of that will also go to Eskom and SA, which compared to previous budgets is much less. But you want to get to a point where the SOEs can stand on their own feet, and that's part of the longer term plan. You don't want to just fill the gaps on an annual basis. And the only way we will get there is by the full restructuring of it, to be more competitive.
Did we get that kind of theme coming through, that this is actually the way government is thinking about this? Or we got short-term patches where the minister was dealing with the historical issues?
I think this was definitely a budget that showed that the government's reform-minded. It's very different from previous budgets. You can almost argue it's a moody budget. They want to say the right thing so that we can potentially avoid a downgrade. It's one thing, for example, to say that, listen, we know the elephant in the room is the wage bill, and we are going to cut 160 billion out of that. That number goes into the budget. That number then provides the ability to say, well, then after that there might be 60 billion for Eskom and SA.
Right.
But that's just an assumption.
Right.
The reality is, at this point in time, we don't know whether we will be able to get 160 billion out of the wage bill, because the negotiations still need to start to happen. So you call him a lion because he's taking on the trade unions, but it's going to be a tough fight. So that's my concern. The message definitely in the right direction compared to a couple of years ago. The delivery, still a big challenge given the decisions.
Clearly, the gloves are off. But I wanted to zero in on the South African Airways debt thing. So the government is saying it's allocating 16.4 billion rand to SAA. Let's put it in simple speak. I'm a journalist, so I have to distill this into a little headline that makes sense for my people. My people are asking me, does that mean that the government has effectively written off SAA's debt and taken it on its books? What has happened?
No.
I think it means, because they say it's taking the guarantees. In other words, it's taking risk of that debt to its books.
Of SAA?
Of SAA.
So SAA is, but over what period of time? Is that immediate? Is SAA free of this debt that is accumulated over the years?
It looks like, because he said on the other restructuring cost, those will be, I don't know whether will it be absorbed into the budget, I'm not sure. But he said it excludes those. So I'm thinking that it's obviously is going to be immediate to a medium term, depending on the commitments of those debts.
Yeah, so we could be talking here about an SAA that's free of its historical debt and the cost associated with that debt.
Yes.
Okay. What does that mean for the government strategy in terms of dealing with the next big one, Eskom?
I think Eskom is a very different game. I think the corpus, the size of the debt burden that Eskom has is much more significant than South African Airways. And critically and aligned to that is the fact that the finance minister spoke about...
But you get my argument from SAA.
So the argument is, does this seem as a line in the sand in terms of the direction that the government will take towards some of the debt of Eskom? I think it's very difficult to be able to compare the two. One, because of the corpus and size of that debt, and secondly, very importantly, because of the amount of debt that government already has, and as Maarten has spoken about the fact that this is a moody budget. It's a budget that really says that we potentially see the possibility of a ratings downgrade by Moody's, and can we allay the market slightly to be able to ensure that perhaps we can delay that? Because the implication of a ratings downgrade by Moody's will be significant, and
sure.
we've spoken about that extensively. So I think, and he was asked this question by journalists pre the budget in terms of what is his view in terms of Eskom, and his view was that we must have further discussions in terms of COSATU's proposal in terms of the pension fund allocation. And his response was, we've discussed Eskom extensively, we need to further that discussion in terms of what the proposal by COSATU might mean, and he even said that it must go beyond just pension funds of state-owned employees, but really South Africans in general. And so I think it's kicking the ball down the road to be able to say, can we find mechanisms and ways, formally NEDLAC, but also outside of NEDLAC, to perhaps start to think about the possibility of a very large debt burden that Eskom has.
I want your thoughts on that as well, but I also wanted clarity on my initial question on what this means for SAA. Does it mean that we're potentially looking here at the success of the business rescue effort for SAA, given it's been freed of this millstone that we know the debt burden has been on its books? Does it?
Just rephrase.
I am trying to understand if it means that SAA is free of this debt burden, and therefore, I mean, if we take away the debt, surely the restructuring of SAA should be a success.
But there are immediate costs that needs to be taken into consideration.
Which have not been factored into here?
Yes.
Okay,
So
all right. Okay, let's park that. Maarten,
So maybe that 60 billion is a liquidity injection to help with the restructuring. So in terms of also making good some of the debt. But SAA will need to go and get, let's say they write down all the debt. Currently SAA is just not a profitable business.
Yeah.
So that's why we're reading about 9 planes for sale and electricity units for sale on the ground, and cutting back the routes and looking at the most profitable routes. So
right.
Even if you remove the debt side of the equation, they will need to restructure to be cash flow positive. Okay. And that's part of
guys,
the...
don't use these words, Maarten. What does
to make money.
mean? Is it cutting stuff? Is it cutting more routes? What is this restructure?
So the whole business rescue to say, well, where are we bleeding? Where are we losing money? Debt is one of those to say, well, for years we actually borrowed too much and now we're paying the interest and it's unsustainable. Okay. But is a non-profitable route? Cut that route. Okay. Try and sell that plane. Okay. So it's to try and get lean and mean. Unfortunately, by doing that, I can't see how you can't have job cuts. If you decide that you're only going to fly Cape Town, Durban, as an example, what do you do with the people that work in the lounge in Port Elizabeth? You can't have a SAA lounge if you're not even flying there. So that's a reality.
It's going to be interesting. And also,
so on this, right, I think which is important is that, yes, the restructuring has really got to do about this concept of lean and mean, but you've got to make sure that it doesn't happen at the expense that you become so anemic as an airline that you're not attractive to consumers, that you're not a value proposition, that you can't compete in the market, that you don't provide the type of customer-centric type of service that is critical in the airline industry, that your price considerations are not fair. So it has to be seen more broadly.
And there's already questions about the government's ability to manage the business rescue because it's interfering with business rescue when it's supposed to be watching this thing unfolding at arm's length. Question marks.
But the thing is, the reason for interference is precisely for labor, because because there's a fear,
rightly or wrongly,
correctly, because there's a fear that there might be job losses, and then job losses leads to instability.
But that's part of business rescue, right?
Yes.
So that's the difficulty, right? When you go down the legal route of business rescue, there are legal implications in terms of the role of the board, the role of the shareholder, the powers of the business rescue practitioner, and it's a tough terrain.
This is a very interesting lesson that we're all picking up from here. Let's go to Eskom. Was there enough on Eskom from your side, or do you think the minister was correct in giving the broad overview that you gave and skipping over most of the detail on Eskom?
Well, I think in the SONA speech as well, they mentioned the fact that they are talking about this proposal from the trade unions. Nothing's been agreed on, but it looks like President Ramaphosa is excited about it. He's very open to further discussion. So let's talk about that. You also mentioned that it's not, is it just a government pension fund or other pension funds as well? There's a fine line here. I think, the fact that Labour wants to be part of the solution is positive.
Yeah.
They're not going on strike and say, forget about this. They say, well, how can we fix this?
Yeah.
In any corporate environment, private sector, to have skin in the game is always good. To have a share in the company you're working for. So to go and say, well, let's go and take some of the government pension fund money. We give employees at Eskom skin in the game. By swapping some of the debt for shareholding, that makes sense. But then the government pension fund is not just Eskom workers. So the teacher down the road is asking, but why should I do that? And I think that's where the risk is growing, because the next step is to say, well, why should only government do it? What about any other private pension fund? So
absolutely.
That brings us back to the whole thing about prescribed assets, which is coming to the table from time to time.
Yeah.
And I guess there, everybody that's got money in a pension fund is asking that question to say, but we're all willing and happy to invest and build capacity, but you're not necessarily in the game of bailing out previous mistakes.
Okay. Is there anything wrong with that, Maarten, though? Because if what we're talking about, I hear you about the teacher asking the question, why am I being dragged into this? Because you also, of course, receive power from Eskom. You are as invested in the success of Eskom as the guy who's sitting inside COSATU.
No, 100%. I fully agree with you. That's why when you say you want prescribed assets, because you want to build capacity for the future, whether it's roads or infrastructure or internet connection or education or schools, then there's a benefit for all of us in terms of that.
Yes.
At this moment, you're basically trying to use prescribed assets to correct the mismanagement of the past 10 years. And that's where some people are saying, but it's not my fault. If we had proper management from day one, we would have been in this situation.
But shouldn't we move the discussion away from why should it be like this to, if you are going to get my support, you need to do X and X and X. In other words, we need to be talking about the governance of those parastatals. We need to talk about very different reporting structures. We need to be talking about how we ensure that the mistakes of the past that you are referring to will not be repeated.
And that's exactly why part of the proposal from the trade unions is to say, we're not just giving you this money. There's some criteria, including things like lifestyle audits for everybody in Eskom, not only the top management. Fast tracking potential arrest and prosecution. Thinking about alternative energy sources. So that, in terms of, that is a positive framework, because you're also pushing them to say you need to get serious about these issues and almost keeping them accountable to actually see the delivery of that.
Absolutely.
I think when he was raising the question of a teacher who's saying, how do I benefit? The thing is, when you look at the state capture, the question is, what is the government doing about it? Because even on the Zondo Commission, we have not seen any consequences. So the other thing is on the governance, to say we continue to have wastage on some of these state-owned entities, including Eskom, of course. Why must I be a stakeholder or participate? Why must my pension be utilized in that manner? Because I don't have control. You correctly said governance. Are they represented? Are they represented on the board in terms of the teachers, those people? Do they have the say on how their money is going to be used? Those are the questions.
Was there anything missing for you in terms of what the minister said to Parliament today on Eskom? Perhaps something that you'd have wanted to hear that would be part of the solution to the Eskom problem?
I think what was missing, which he was very careful. Remember, it was last year they were talking about separation into three business
units.
Three units. Transmission being
generation and distribution.
But the transmission was to be completed in March this year.
Next month.
This month. Right.
Well, in a couple of days.
But
end of March.
End of March. But
okay.
The budget is very silent in terms of the cost allocated to that process. Whether that process is still continuing or not.
We don't know.
We don't know.
Okay. You want to come in? Because my next question is, how complicated are those negotiations going to be, given the opening salvo that we saw today, Tito Mboweni aiming at the unions? 160 billion rand in cuts on wage costs in the next 3 years.
So I think it's particularly complex. I think he's drawn a line in the sand in terms of a bloated civil service, and very importantly, the cost of that wage bill and the bear of that wage bill in terms of the overall budget. So one, this ability to say that we can potentially bring about savings of 160 billion it's a great statement, but the devil's in the detail. Can you bring the unions to the negotiating table? Can you engage with people in the civil service? Can you find some trade-offs? Can you really speak about this, as you've rightly said, psychological contracting between employees, between South Africans broadly, and the immediate term requirements to be able to address some of the liquidity challenges that we have? In the absence of that psychological contracting, it becomes almost impossible to be able to get all of the parties around a negotiating table. So that's the one. I think the second is that we've got a splintered labor environment at the moment with a number of different trade unions. So it's no longer a discussion only in the tripartite alliance or discussion in the NEC of the ANC. It's a broad discussion. And I think South Africans are grappling with this challenge that we talk too much. And when can we be able to take the tough decisions that are necessary for us to be able to take both in the public and private sector, to find ways in which we can collaborate more closely, to find ways where we can all put skin in the game. And I think the hard question around this is who has the convening capability.
I was actually going to ask you that question myself. Because I was listening to you and I'm thinking, yeah, great idea. It's like that story of the cat and the mice, right? You know, somebody thinks up a great idea. How do we catch the cat? Well, we put a bell around his neck. But the question is, who's going to bell the cat? Who is going to be this convener that's comfortable for him, comfortable for you, for me, for you, and them?
So I think the first challenge that both the President and the Finance Minister has is the ability to be able to convene within the ANC. What is the ANC's position in terms of some of these factors? I foresee the possibility that people within the ANC will disagree with what the Finance Minister has put forward today. And if that's the case, then the ANC needs to find a consolidated view in terms of how does it see the medium to long-term trajectory of the country, and then to be able to bring all of these different parties together, which is really hard to do in an environment that's very fractious at the moment.
So we are talking about Eskom, we're talking about South African Airways, but we know how many others are out there?
Many more.
There was no
Did you hear any declaration of the kind of strategy that we're likely to see from the government going forward on parastatals? For the ANC, of course, privatization is still anathema.
But in this whole framework, you know, the fact that then they still talk about a state bank, which is another SOE.
Trying to please the unions.
And well, I'm just asking myself, you know, if you look at the track record, should we now start another state bank? Shouldn't we just try and take the post office as an example and get a working relationship with some of the other commercial banks? That was just showing in terms of the state-owned enterprises that, you know, there's room for further drainage, because to start a bank you need a lot of capital as well. Which is going to be a challenge.
The minister gave us a lot of to chew in this budget, isn't it? We've got 3 minutes, guys, so I need to get your closing thoughts in terms of your overall budget that was presented by the minister and what it means. And one of the questions I asked in an earlier panel was whether Mboweni can survive this budget. I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I think the general feedback so far has been quite positive. So now it's more a question in terms of how strong is the trade unions, because they were the first, just after the budget, issuing a release to say, well, you know, we haven't been engaging on these issues. So that will be his challenge. But in terms, I think the NEC and the economic plan, it's right in the middle of that. That's what they want to achieve. It is now to actually get the groups around the table to actually have the discussion. So for me, it's actually not whether he will survive, but whether the framework that he put on the table will survive. In other words, will we be able to deliver those numbers in 3 years? That will be the determining factor.
I hope he will fall or rise with those numbers.
So I think cautious optimism. I think some elements of the budget really take us in the right direction. One, allocation of spectrum. Two, the ability to be able to look at the wage bill within the public sector. Three, reallocation of some of the budget allocation that otherwise would go to different parts of government, not taking away from health and education, but perhaps some environments where we can actually curtail some of the spending and put it towards some of the debt burden we have. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, the fact that he provided, despite all of the sentiment beforehand, a possibility of a VAT increase, the possibility of a tax increase, a measured budget that says it's important that consumers and taxpayers have a little bit more money in the pocket. And my view is that if he can get some of this right, I think we'll move in the right direction.
Your thoughts?
I think for
Very
me,
quickly.
there are a number of control measures that he put in place. For example, the cost containment, the issue of getting the right skill for the jobs.
Yeah.
If he can get those right, I think he will survive.
Absolutely. I think we're going to call Tito Mboweni many names: a magician, a lion, the man with the sword, or perhaps the man with an axe. Whatever we're going to call him, it's going to be a testing time for him for the next year or so. I want to thank my guest, Makgopa Tshehla, Professor, Financial Management at the Unisa Graduate School of Business Leadership, Abdullah Verachia from Gibs, and Maarten Ackerman, Chief Economist at Citadel. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for our chance to chat on the state-owned enterprises and the minister's budget today. We're going to take a break. On the other side, we are going to continue covering this story and asking the question, has he done it? Or will March 27 see us cut to junk and real junk this time? Thank you for watching.